Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Emily and Daniel had been together for 10 years, and everyone around them believed they were proof that love could stand the test of time. They had 2 young kids, a comfortable home, and a routine that, to any outsider, looked solid. But behind the smiles at family gatherings and the cheerful photos on social media, the couple was quietly worn down. It wasn't a lack of affection or respect, but the passion, the fire that once burned so intensely, now felt like fading embers. It was on one of those ordinary nights, after a dinner where they barely exchanged words, that Emily surprised Daniel. While he cleared the dishes from the table, she spoke calmly but seriously about something she'd been holding inside for months. She said maybe what their marriage needed wasn't another trip, a fancy restaurant, or an expensive gift. She wanted to take a risk, try something that could reignite the desire that once brought them together so powerfully. Emily mentioned a place she'd heard about in hushed conversations, a swingers club. Daniel stayed silent for a few moments, trying to process what he'd just heard. The idea seemed absurd, even dangerous. After all, they were talking about opening their marriage, something that had always been built on loyalty. But when he looked up and saw his wife's face lit with genuine anticipation, he realized this wasn't just a passing whim. It was a request filled with hope. She believed that by going through this experience together, they could rekindle something that had been lost amid daily responsibilities. He took a deep breath and asked if Emily was sure. She said yes, that she'd already thought through the boundaries they'd need to set to make it safe for both of them. Clear rules, absolute trust, and above all, respect. Daniel hesitated. He loved his wife, but the thought of seeing her share smiles and intimacy with someone else hurt him deeply. Still, part of him wanted to believe that this leap into the unknown could strengthen the bond they'd built. A few days later, the couple parked in front of a discreet house. The lit windows hinted at activity inside, but nothing revealed the place's true purpose. Emily was excited, fixing her hair, taking deep breaths like she was about to step onto a stage. Daniel, on the other hand, felt his stomach twist. He was there because he wanted to make his wife happy, but he couldn't shake the weight of uncertainty. Inside, they were greeted with a warm smile by an elegant hostess who explained the rules and led them into a spacious room. Couples of all ages were scattered around, some chatting on sofas, others dancing to soft music. The atmosphere felt safe, almost like a secret community sharing a silent pact of trust. Emily looked around in fascination, as if she'd just stepped into a whole new world. She held Daniel's hand tightly, trying to reassure him, and he, despite his inner turmoil, responded by holding back. They sat in a quiet corner, were handed glasses of wine, and started talking to a friendly couple who seemed experienced in this world. Laughter came easily, as if they'd known each other for years. Emily grew more relaxed with each passing minute, while Daniel kept a restrained smile, watching everything closely. At one point, a man respectfully complimented Emily, commenting on the energy she gave off. Daniel's heart raced, but he was surprised to see his wife respond with a sparkle in her eyes, one he hadn't seen in a long time. There was no disrespect, no exaggeration, just a simple gesture that awakened a forgotten sense of femininity in her. And somehow, that stirred something in him too. At the end of the night, they drove home in silence. Emily rested her head on Daniel's shoulder, as if that small gesture said everything. She was happy they'd taken the first step. He drove quietly, torn between fear and hope. Part of him believed this experience could truly reignite their connection. Another part feared they'd opened a door they might never be able to close. When they got home, Emily hugged him intensely, different from the mechanical routine of the past few months. He hugged her back, trying to convince himself he'd made the right choice. That night, they didn't just sleep as husband and wife, they slept as partners in a newly shared secret, a pact that could either save them or destroy them. After that first visit, Emily seemed to rediscover a dormant energy inside her. Her gaze carried a new intensity, as if she'd found a part of herself lost in the routine of being a mom, wife, and professional. Daniel noticed this change in everyday life. She woke up more cheerful, spoke with enthusiasm about small things, and even the way she dressed showed a new level of care. Every detail revealed that something inside her had been awakened. Conversations at home began to revolve around experiences they could have together. Emily talked about the previous night like someone recalling a meaningful trip, full of discoveries. She described the people she'd met, how freeing it felt to talk without judgment, how everything was designed to help each couple find their own limits. Daniel listened, trying to absorb her excitement, but deep down, a growing unease settled in his chest. He wanted to share her joy, but a quiet restlessness was hard to ignore. On later visits, Emily grew more confident. She dressed with a boldness Daniel barely recognized. She laughed loudly, exchanged glances, danced without hesitation. There was a lightness in her movements, a vitality that captivated everyone around her. Her magnetism was impossible to ignore. People approached her easily, and Emily connected with them naturally, as if she'd always belonged in this world. Daniel stood beside her, trying to keep his composure, but he felt a piece of control slipping through his fingers with every encounter. One night, another man invited Emily to dance. The gesture was simple and respectful, but the way she accepted it, smiling naturally, made Daniel feel invisible. He watched them interact, saw his wife lose herself in the music, carefree and more alive than she'd been at any party they'd attended. And in that moment, a sharp thought cut through him, maybe that spark in her eyes wasn't just because of him anymore. Still, Daniel tried to convince himself he was still essential to this adventure. He told himself that at the end of each night, Emily still returned to his arms. She always said everything they did there was meant to strengthen their relationship, that none of these encounters could replace their bond. But silently, he started to doubt. Late at night, lying side by side, Emily talked about how alive she felt, how this world had given her the courage to rediscover herself. Daniel answered with short phrases, hiding the confusion consuming him. He looked at her, a radiant woman full of desire, while he felt increasingly faded. It was as if the same world that freed her was trapping him. The contrast between them grew more obvious each day. Emily talked about the friends they were making, the stories she heard, the possibilities they hadn't explored yet. Daniel, on the other hand, found himself in silence, wondering if he could truly keep up with this pact. At times, her joy even infected him, but soon after, insecurity returned, leaving him torn between the deep love he felt for his wife and the bitter sense that she was drifting away. It was during this phase that Emily began to show a confidence bordering on boldness. She said, for the first time in many years, she felt like herself, desired, complete. Daniel, while recognizing the beauty in that, carried a growing emptiness in his chest with every outing. He realized this path, which at first seemed like a game to rekindle their marriage, was profoundly changing his wife. And he didn't know if he had the strength to follow her to the end of this journey. Daniel began to feel the weight of the choices they'd made together. During the day, he tried to hold on to simple routines, making coffee, watching a game on TV, but there was always a void he couldn't fill. Emily, in contrast, seemed to have found an endless source of energy. She'd laugh to herself remembering conversations, spend more time texting on her phone, and even the way she spoke about him had grown distant. When he tried to bring up everyday topics, she'd answer quickly, as if her mind was somewhere else. One Saturday morning, Daniel walked into the bedroom and saw her smiling at her phone screen. He asked who she was talking to, and Emily, without hesitation, said just some friends from the club. Her tone was light, almost natural, but his heart raced. For the first time, he felt like an intruder in his own marriage. It wasn't just jealousy. It was the clear realization that her excitement wasn't limited to nights at the club anymore. It was spilling into their life, even invading moments that should have belonged only to them. He tried to compensate. He booked dinner at a restaurant they used to visit when they were dating, hoping to reignite memories that were theirs alone. Emily tried to enjoy it, but she didn't show the same spark she had when talking about her new friends or recent experiences. To Daniel, it was a silent blow. He realized that even at a table full of memories, she was already somewhere else. Later attempts failed too. He invited her for walks in the park, prepared small surprises at home, planned a short trip. Emily accepted everything, never refusing, but her energy always felt measured, as if nothing could truly satisfy her. With each of his gestures, her response grew more routine. He began to see that the problem wasn't lack of effort, it was the contrast between two worlds, his, simple and predictable, and hers, full of novelty and excitement. One night, when he came home from work, he found Emily sitting on the sofa, typing intensely on her phone. He asked what she was talking about, and she said it was just a couple they'd met, exchanging ideas about their next meetup. Daniel stayed quiet, but inside, a mix of anguish and frustration consumed him. He never imagined he'd feel jealous of strangers, but now he felt like he was competing for his wife's attention. Arguments started to emerge, small fights over trivial things, but always charged with tension. He questioned her, and Emily countered, saying she was just living what they'd agreed on. Her tone shifted between patience and impatience, as if he were placing limits on something that had become part of her daily life. Each fight ended with him withdrawing into silence, while Emily remained firm in her belief that this was liberating. What hurt Daniel most was how she seemed to have transformed into a different woman, and he no longer knew how to reach her. He looked at Emily and saw someone confident, radiant, desired by everyone. Meanwhile, he saw himself fading, like a supporting character in a story once shared equally by both. The contrast pulled him into heavy thoughts at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to imagine how to rebuild something that seemed to be slipping away before his eyes. At this point, Daniel realized what began as a bold pact to rekindle passion was turning into a maze. He was walking without knowing where to go, caught between his deep love for Emily and the fear that she'd already found a happiness that no longer required him in the same way. And this thought became a constant companion, eating away at his certainty each new day. Emily and Daniel started avoiding each other at home. It was easier to talk about monthly bills than the thing eating them alive. He'd try to make small talk while preparing dinner, she'd answer briefly. The tension in the air had a name, but neither had the courage to say it out loud. Until the day Daniel stopped circling the issue. He put his phone away, closed the kitchen door, and called Emily into the living room. He said what he'd been rehearsing in his mind, he wanted to end this experience for good. No pauses, no "let's see later." He wanted their marriage back, closed, intimate, simple. Emily took a deep breath before answering. She didn't speak impulsively. She explained that this had given her back something she thought she'd lost, a joy that didn't depend on approval, a confidence that showed in her body and voice. She insisted she loved the life they'd built, but she couldn't pretend nothing had changed inside. She asked him to listen without turning the conversation into an ultimatum. Daniel said he was listening, but he also needed to be heard. The feeling of being excluded was consuming him. He felt like someone had pulled the rug out from under his identity. He loved his wife, but the price of following her was too high. They tried a compromise. He proposed a strict 90-day break, no invitations, no exchanges, no messages with people from the club. A period to remember who they were alone, to bring intimacy back to the center. Emily stayed quiet for a few seconds, bit her lip, thought. She offered another idea, rare meetups, under even stricter rules, with honest debriefs the next day, focused solely on them. Daniel acknowledged the effort but asked the painful question, "Are you willing to give this up completely if that's what saves us?" Emily faced her own contradiction. She said she didn't want to lie. The truth was, part of her now saw this practice as an extension of her identity. The conversation soured when her phone buzzed. A message from a couple they knew at the club. Emily turned the screen face down, which only worsened Daniel's feeling. He calmly asked her to let them know they were stepping away indefinitely. Emily said she'd send a polite message, without promises. He repeated that he needed a clear gesture. They stared at each other like opponents avoiding the final blow out of fear of the damage. The following week, there was a themed night at the club. They'd confirmed their attendance before all this. Daniel quietly cancelled, sending a short message from his own phone. Emily saw the sent message, no turning back. She still got ready, as if she were going out, tied her hair, put on the earrings he always complimented. Then she sat on the sofa, staring at her reflection in the dark screen of the turned-off TV. She took off the earrings. Put away the lipstick. Stood up and turned off the living room light. This was a small story within their home. It began with expectation, passed through wounded pride, ended with a silent plea for understanding. They ate dinner together in the kitchen, each trying to get closer without touching the subject. It was a truce without agreement. Encouraged by this fragile truce, Daniel planned a night to revisit good memories. He ordered the same pasta from the restaurant where they first met, printed old photos, and prepared a game of silly questions they used to play to laugh at themselves. The night started light. Emily got emotional seeing a photo of them holding the keys to their first apartment. She kissed her husband with genuine affection. For a moment, the atmosphere felt like the beginning again. Until the phone on the counter lit up. A club friend tagged Emily in a post about the next party. An involuntary smile slipped out, small, but visible. It was enough to break the spell. Daniel quietly gathered the game cards. Emily apologized, said the smile was automatic. He said he understood, and precisely because he understood, he was lost. The arguments came, short and sharp. Daniel insisted the marriage was becoming secondary. Emily argued the marriage was, for the first time, moving without guilt, with honesty. He shot back that truth without care becomes a knife. She replied that care without truth becomes a prison. The worst moment came when he asked directly, "If I ask you to choose, will you choose me?" Emily held back tears. She said she'd choose him every day as her husband and partner, but choosing only him would mean erasing something that made her reborn. Daniel said he understood her courage, but he needed courage for himself too. They tried writing new rules on a sheet of paper. No messages during the week. No outside connections beyond the club. Us two come first. One rule after another, the page turned into a mosaic of limits. Emily read it aloud and barely recognized herself. Daniel read it and felt like he was trying to fight a fire with duct tape. He crumpled the paper and threw it in the trash. Emily stood up, picked up the crumpled sheet, and smoothed it out again. She said she'd agree to the rules if they came from real desire, not fear. Daniel replied that his real desire was simple, exclusivity. The word hung in the air, heavy. On the day of their older daughter's recital, they sat side by side in the school auditorium. The girl searched for her parents and smiled when she found them. Emily brushed her fingers against his hand, asking for a gesture of reconnection. Daniel slowly pulled his hand away, as if refusing to promise what he couldn't deliver. There was no fight. Just silence that slowly kills. Another story within the main one. It began with a child's performance, passed through a restrained touch, ended with two adults who loved their daughter but no longer knew how to love each other without hurting. That night, Daniel called Emily again to talk. No special meal, no old photos, no romantic script. He said he was at his limit. Firmly, he repeated that he wanted to end everything. Emily leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and faced the essential question: is it worth giving up yourself to maintain the image of a perfect marriage? She didn't answer. She only asked what he'd do if she said she needed that world to feel whole. Daniel was honest: "I love you, but I lose myself in there. I lose myself." Emily cried silently. She didn't defend herself. Didn't justify. She just let tears translate the rupture. She stood, went to the bedroom, and brought back a box of memories, travel invites, concert tickets, letters they'd exchanged in the beginning. She spread everything on the table. She asked him to look closely. "This is our story. I don't want to throw it away. But I've changed inside. And changing doesn't mean loving you less." Daniel ran his fingers over an old ticket, smiled faintly remembering a fall he took at a concert, then closed the box. "I've changed too. And now I need peace to keep loving you without destroying myself." They decided to sleep in separate rooms for a while. A hard call, but an honest one. The next day, they only shared necessary logistics for the week, each preserving their own space in the home they still shared. Emily called her club friend and said she was out indefinitely, but the words tasted bitter, followed by a silence that accused loss. Daniel went to the living room and wrote in a notebook what he had the courage to stand by: fidelity, care, presence. He looked at the 3 words and understood they were pillars for him, but for her, they might have taken on a different meaning. That evening, Emily entered the living room with a final plea. She proposed a closing ritual, a clear end, a farewell to that world, just the two of them, together, to close the door without guilt. Daniel listened, thanked her for the gesture, and declined. He said the only farewell he could face was one that placed them face to face, with no third parties, focusing on what could still be saved between 4 walls. Emily wiped her eyes and agreed that if there was to be a farewell, it would happen right there, between them, with truths spoken clearly. They sat in silence for a while, side by side on the sofa, each holding on to their own emptiness. There was no reconciling hug. No promises. Just the collapse of the old pact and the clear realization that from here on, every step would carry the weight of choice. When they stood up, the house was the same, but the marriage had crossed an internal threshold. The collapse wasn't explosive, it was a decision. And sometimes, decisions break hearts with more precision than any scream. Sleeping in separate rooms became a quiet routine. The house kept running, the kids woke up for school, messages passed through texts, and social life shrank to what was essential. Emily stayed away from the club. Daniel avoided checking her phone, though curiosity nagged at him. The pause brought a kind of calm neither wanted to admit as relief, because accepting that would feel like defeat. Still, this truce opened space for one final attempt: couples therapy. In the therapist's office, she asked them to write on separate cards 2 sentences: "What has changed in you?" and "What about the other do you want to protect?" Emily wrote that she'd found courage to exist as a whole woman. On Daniel's card, she wrote, his loyalty. Daniel wrote that his boundaries had become clear. And about Emily, he wrote, her light. The cards were read aloud. Both were moved. The sparkle in her eyes at the word light was genuine. So was the silence that followed. The therapist suggested a 1-week exercise: live as a couple without letting the recent past dictate every move. Cook together. Sleep in the same bed for 3 nights. Talk about old dreams, ones born before all this. They agreed. On the first night of the trial, Daniel made her favorite pasta. Emily came into the kitchen without makeup, a simple gesture that, to him, spoke louder than long speeches. They ate, laughed at a silly memory, talked about the kids. When they lay down, the conversation drifted into that delicate space where love lives alongside fear. Emily said, "I feel like I've lost you inside." He replied, "I feel like I've lost you to a version of yourself I can't reach." They slept in each other's arms, and neither called it a return, nor a goodbye. It was just an island in the middle of a stormy sea. On the second day, the therapist asked each to tell a short story, beginning, middle, end, about something meaningful they'd shared. Emily told of the day Daniel helped her study for a tough exam years ago. She said he turned their living room into a board of notes and made her believe she could do it. Daniel told of the day Emily took him to visit his sick father and held his father's hand until the end, never leaving his side. Both stories met at the same point: care. It was beautiful. It was real. It wasn't enough to cover the gap. In the third session came the direct question: are you willing to give up what you've discovered to stay together? Emily looked down, clenched her hands, searched for honesty. She said she was proud of her newfound courage and didn't want to go back to a life where her desires were locked in a drawer. Daniel breathed and said he was tired of feeling like a visitor in his own marriage. The therapist didn't celebrate or mourn. She simply said that sometimes, mature choice splits two different loves, the one that stays and the one that lets go. They decided like adults. Emily suggested an amicable separation, respectful, with organized routines for the kids, holidays shared fairly. Daniel agreed. They set a date to sign the papers. The week before, there was one last attempt to delay. It was her who made it. Not to return to the club, but to propose something new. What if we invent a marriage of our own, separate homes, no third parties, scheduled meetups like dating? Daniel listened fully. The idea had poetry, but to him, it sounded like another patch. He thanked her and said he needed to truly close this chapter to preserve the good that remained. The night before signing, Emily went to the car alone and sat there with the engine off, her phone in her bag. Total silence. She remembered their first night at the club and Daniel's first look at her from the altar, many years ago. Different weights, memories fighting for space. She cried quietly. She picked up the phone and opened the chat with her club friends. She typed, "I'm out of this world." Deleted it. Typed another, "Thank you, it was an important chapter." Deleted it again. She tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and just sat with her own breath, realizing that in the end, no one decides for you who you are inside. She went back home and put the phone in the drawer. It was a small story within the bigger one. It began with temptation, passed through goodbye, ended with the courage to be alone with her own truth. The day arrived. At the courthouse, the air smelled of fresh paper and pen ink. They sat side by side, hands on the table. The clerk explained the terms, asked for signatures in triplicate, pointed where to initial. Daniel signed first. Emily held the pen, paused for a second, and signed too. No scenes, no speeches. Just a legal end to something that had already ended inside. The surprise came afterward, as they stepped into the hallway. Emily pressed the folder to her chest, as if protecting something fragile, and said softly, "I need to tell you something." Daniel froze. He braced himself for any version of the recent past. Emily pulled out her phone, opened a photo, no filters, a test result. "I found out yesterday. I tried to tell you before signing, but I was afraid it would seem like a bargaining chip." Daniel stared at the image. 2 lines. His heart raced, and the entire world shrank to the size of that news. Emily added, "It's yours. We know why." With them, everything was controlled. Between us, it was just like always. He leaned against the wall and ran his hand over his face. It was joy and terror in the same breath. Emily breathed, "I'm not asking you to come back. I'm asking you to stay as a father, fully." The bomb wasn't loud. It was clarity. Right there, facing the end they'd signed themselves, was a beginning. Daniel asked to see the test again, as if his brain needed the eyes to confirm. Then he said quietly, "I'll be at every appointment, every tough night, every school note." Emily cried and laughed at once, no makeup, no masks, no confusing words from the past weeks. He held her hands and asked, "Can you forgive me for not being the man of your new world?" She replied, "Can you forgive me for becoming a woman who scares you?" They stood facing each other for a few seconds, until Daniel said, "Forgiveness doesn't change the past, but it changes the direction." They went together to the first appointment. The doctor was straightforward, explaining timelines, risks, vitamins. On the screen, a tiny flickering dot. Emily gripped her tissue. Daniel, for the first time in months, felt complete peace in his chest. It wasn't a return to marriage. It was a clear purpose. They left with the folder of test results, and in the hospital hallway, he stopped, pulled his wedding ring from his pocket, kept since the separation, and placed it inside the same folder holding the divorce papers. He said, "This isn't a comeback. It's respect for our story. We end as a couple and begin as a new family. I'll be the father I promised to be." In the following days, they organized their lives with the care that had always been missing in their fights. They set days, times, bills, school, family support. Emily called her club friend and said, firmly, she was in a new phase. The friend tried the freedom speech. Emily replied, "Freedom without purpose empties me. My purpose now has a heartbeat." She hung up without guilt. Then she texted Daniel, "First ultrasound with sound, Thursday. You coming?" He replied simply, "I'll be there early." There was one last small story before the big turn. The school scheduled a performance for the kids. Daniel and Emily sat in the same row, an empty seat between them that, this time, didn't hurt. When their daughter finished, she ran to them with her certificate. Emily pointed to her still discreet belly and whispered in the girl's ear, "There's a surprise coming." The child's eyes widened, and she hugged both of them at once, as if in one gesture she proved that family is also what you choose to care for when love changes form. Months later, on the day of delivery, Emily entered the room focused and prepared. Daniel stayed by her side the whole time, holding her hand, guiding her breaths. When the baby's cry filled the air, no grand words were spoken. He leaned his forehead against hers and whispered, "Thank you for letting me stay." Emily replied, "Thank you for staying even when you didn't." The nurse placed the baby in her arms. Emily looked at the tiny face, then at Daniel. "Want to pick the name?" He smiled, wiped his eyes, and said, "Grace, to remember that grace came when everything seemed lost." Emily stroked the baby, "Grace Miller. It's beautiful." Before leaving the hospital, Daniel took the folder with the divorce papers and the pregnancy test. He placed the ring between them, closed it, and handed it to Emily with a simple note clipped to it, "Love is a choice. Today I choose to be your life partner in whatever way life allows, a full father, a loyal friend, a safe harbor. If one day we choose each other again as a couple, let it be from abundance, not fear. If not, let our children grow up seeing what respect looks like." Emily read it, hugged the folder and the baby, and the three of them walked out of the hospital with an agreement no courthouse could register, turning pain into care. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.